First of all, I'm really honored to be here, and I thank you, Colleen and Aeyal, for inviting me to present here. I started with the conclusion of the book, and as I read it, I said I really envy them. I wish I could write it myself. There were so many brilliant thoughts there, and I was wondering, what do I want to pick up on, and where do I want to start in this? And so I looked right and left, and on my table I found another book for which I'm writing a review now, and that's The AIDS Drugs for All. So I'm actually going to start with the other book, but I promise I'll get back to all the exemplary features of yours as well. The importance of the global action around developing and making HIV/AIDS medication accessible was a particularly influential component in the making of the human right to health. Flood and Gross justly listed as one of the factors promoting the right, side by side with the rising recognition of social rights more generally, the fall of the Eastern Bloc, processes of democratization, and other factors they mention. The contribution of the fight for HIV treatment and medication to the recognition of the right to health as a universal right is not obvious, nor was it the single choice for the advocates in the early days of the struggle. Kapsky and Busby, who studied the 3 decades of the global social battle for people with HIV and AIDS, identified strategic choices that were made intentionally. I know, but we have to kind of absorb the exercise, at least contemplate about it if we're not doing anything. Yeah, half a minute and it will pass. But it's something to write home about, you know.
Exactly, to celebrate the book. There's a national assignment.
Okay, I think we can. Okay. So as I said, the advocates had to consider various strategies. Some were intentional, others not. And the issue at stake was that of framing, and framing being norm entrepreneurs must speak to aspects of belief systems of life worlds that transcend a specific cultural or a political context. So should the slogan of the activists focus on gays and Africans, on poverty and inequality, or on human rights? And if it's human right, is it the right to life, or the right to health, or the right to equal treatment? Or perhaps change from rights to arguments on victimization, or alternatively on agency? Reach out for mercy, or deserve entitlements? What are the trade-offs when such choices have to be made? There was no single choice of reference, nor was there a single agent. Like in other instances of social struggles, particularly at the transnational levels, framing strategies chosen by agents may complement or conflict. However, it was generally agreed that the vast territorial scope and its implication on a host of arrangements, ranging from intellectual property to trade, politics, foreign affairs, health concerns, all of these aspects of the HIV/AIDS battle require a universal message. And the language of human rights was found to be particularly apt because it conveys the fundamental importance of the claim, its universality, and it enables to transcend some of the thorny details in favor of a timeless claim on the fundamental entitlements of the human being. On the basis of the discussion of the AIDS treatment advocacy, I would like to turn to the book on the right to health. The book on the right to health would seem to be a good place to visit when trying to understand what is really the right to health that the advocates pursued. At the outset, I should emphasize that there is a gap between human rights as a way of framing a social struggle and human rights as a legal institution. The two aspects of human rights are interrelated, but they are not identical. The book by Flood and Gross emphasizes the latter, the legal aspect, but it is highly sensitive to the former aspect, and indeed, this is one of its strengths. In the following minutes, I would like to highlight the importance of the book and its extraordinary accomplishments, touching on three interrelated aspects. First, the comparative methodology. Second, the substantive findings. And thirdly, reflect on the integration of the national with the transnational. So I'll start with the methodology. The book is first and foremost a comparative take on the right to health. After paying tribute to the international origins in the Perth pages, for example, the General Comment 14 by the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the book seeks to identify the role of rights when they meet the ground. This is particularly important because human rights still rely, to a great extent, on territorial landing spots that abide by national legal systems. Now, national comparisons often end up with the conclusion that one state practices X and the other state practices Y. Okay, but this is not sufficiently helpful because legal institutions are strongly embedded in social, economic, and political institutions, and the mere comparison of laws is inadequate. The book attempts to conduct a much more sophisticated comparison that embeds the legal regime in the political economy. And two aspects here are of particular importance. First, there is a preliminary classification of countries into three models: the public tax-financed health system, the social health insurance, and the mixed public-private. Now, the classification into three models allows identifying differences between categories and also within them. This strategy follows a host of studies in the literature on the welfare state and on social matters, and particularly I thought about the classification by Josta Esping Anderson on the three worlds of welfare capitalism. There is no direct overlap between the editor's classification here in terms of healthcare regimes and in the welfare state regimes literature, but it would have been useful to draw on existing classifications in order to provide an even stronger basis for the very thoughtful classification that the editors put out there. A second point is that the emphasis on the human right to health rather than health law generally or health systems generally aids in pinpointing the instructions extended to the authors. And I thought this was really remarkable because it's very difficult to do a comparative volume and able to move beyond the black letter description of the law. The authors succeeded in demonstrating recurring patterns that characterize the different models. And within models, there are also deviants. This resonates, again, with the studies in welfare regimes that countervail the assumption that the rolling back of the welfare state is indicative of convergence around the world. Instead, the challenges in the various models are different, and what may seem to be a process of convergence is actually a preservation of very distinct models. When reviewing some of the chapters, I looked for those that were particularly engaged with the HIV/AIDS patients, noted by the editors at the opening pages to be a cause for the growing interest in the right to health. Naturally, despite the common template that was given to the chapter's authors, each author chose what to emphasize in their chapters. The authors of three BRICS countries, Brazil, South Africa, and India. These are the three authors that decided to highlight the HIV/AIDS, and I found that to be interesting. China, another BRICS country, did not deal with that directly. And here I wonder how the distinction between models can help explain these particular emphases, and this moves me to the second point, but discussing a bit the findings that the editors summarize nicely. One of the book's findings is that the countries with a well-developed and relatively egalitarian access to health are actually not reliant on human rights to health as a legal pillar that upholds the political institutions of healthcare. In the countries with the comprehensive medical coverage, issues regarding HIV and AIDS patients from the outset required much activism, but the human rights framing was not necessarily the instrument of choice in the courtroom. It was more a claim in the media and in the streets. Human rights are most likely, the editors note, to play a role in the public-private model, particularly because the countries that are included in this model are countries that have more recently adopted constitutions, reflecting the rising importance of social rights in the last 2 to 3 decades. At the other end of the spectrum, Nigeria, with its devastating economic difficulties in providing basic care, cannot rely on claims of human rights entitlements when the budget constraints are so severe. Humanitarian arguments aimed at the international community or the pharmaceutical companies may probably be more instrumental to advocacy in such a country. The BRICS countries, so here in this case it would be the India, Brazil, and South Africa, bring together dire need, but also some room for maneuver to affect priorities. The international community's involvement in BRICS countries and the economic interest in these markets also places them at the center of attention of other nations and international organizations alike. So this is my hypothesis. I can open it up for debate. But the advantage of the editor's comparative methodology is that it accommodates making such structural hypotheses that ask about which legal norms are being used, who uses them, what venues are they being used in, rather than simply stating what the state of the law is. Reflecting on such findings, it may be argued that the human rights are not really important, or that there is an inverse relationship between the recognition of human rights and the quality of the institutional structure of healthcare. The book does not endorse this claim, but it also does not refute it wholesale. On the one hand, the clustering of countries into distinct models suggests that the effects of human right is not about more health, the right to health, or less right to health, but about their distinctive qualitative role in each and different type of system. Where there is a well-developed institutional system, there is little need for making claims by reference to human rights. By contrast, where the borderlines between private and public are vast, there is constant friction, and this is the room for the human rights litigation. Moreover, oftentimes the courts will not use the right to health, and here I kind of tap on to Daphna, will not use the right to health or other social rights as the sine qua non basis of their decision. We can see that cases that can easily be framed in advanced administrative law also rely on the right to health. It's kind of a side benefit. Hence, the right is a source of justification for the court's action. And then, rather than asking, who do social rights constrain, we should ask, who do social rights serve and how? Consequently, the success of human rights generally and social rights in particular is in their ability to bring an issue to the forefront, rather than assuming it can settle a debate between various legal options. Whether as a way to frame the activist agenda, or whether as a way for judges to justify their intervention. Between activists and the court, there is also an ongoing learning and experimentation, where the parties study each other's framing and justification, and what reactions to such strategic choices entail. The power of the human right to health, as noted at the outset with regard to the advocacy on behalf of people with HIV and AIDS, is in its universality. To the judges as well, importing the right from the universal and the global context helps in justifying a decision rather than settling the case. The international and the universal provide support, not a constraint. And this brings me to the final point, that it integrates the methodological and the substantive, and that's about globalization. The comparative study the book presents is based on a comparison between several states on the basis of a semi-structured template that was given to the authors. I think it was brilliant, really. The human right develops at the international level, at the Covenant, for the economic, social, and cultural rights, other international instruments, and then it is absorbed at the different nation states. In this, the global is exogenous factor in the study of the national. And this is the common pattern for most comparative study. We have something out there at the universal global, and we ask how it affects us here at the national level. However, in recognizing that the right to health gained recognition by actual practices in law and in social advocacy, like in the HIV/AIDS context, the authors rightly imply that the global is also affected by the national, as well as by episodes that transcend national boundaries, such as the well-studied case of litigation in South Africa. Hence, the comparative method that is adopted in the book emphasizes one direction of a process in which there are actually two directions, or double endogeneity. The global is fed by the local, and the local draws on the global. In this process of double endogeneity, it is important to notice which agents, states, international NGOs, international organizations, influence more and which are being influenced. Identifying this dynamic chain is important for understanding how the right develops its heuristic strength in accommodating judges and activists. Moreover, in understanding the role of the right to health in transnational context, perhaps the comparison between states doesn't fully capture the complexity, and comparisons should be between states and the transnational arena, between international institutions of different sorts, trade, labor, health, between NGOs and INGOs, between political parties and extra-political activists. The Westphalian delineation of the world obstructs the fact that processes are now taking place at multiple dimensions and levels, not all of which are really territorial or national. So, to conclude, when thinking about the advocacy for people with HIV and AIDS, which took place around the world in different arenas and spheres, we cannot fully capture its impact on solidifying the right to health's posture without thinking how processes transplanted from one chapter of the book to another, that is, from one nation state to the other, and from the introductory pages that discuss the international recognition to the subsequent chapters that discuss its appearances in the various nation states. So I'm eagerly waiting for the next volume, but this one was remarkable. Thank you.